Faye Harlow was the kind of person New York City forgot on purpose. 27 years old, 93 pounds of exhaustion on a rusted delivery bike, pedaling through Manhattan at 2 a.m. with frozen fingers and a stomach that hadn't seen a real meal in 3 days. She split a roach-infested studio in Queens with 3 strangers, slept on a deflating air mattress on the kitchen floor, and rode 12-hour shifts, delivering food to people who never once looked at her face. She'd been invisible ever since the night her younger brother Tommy took a bullet in a Queens convenience store during their youth, while she stood right outside and froze for 11 seconds. 11 seconds that cost Tommy his life and left nothing inside her but guilt and muscle memory. Years of grief followed until their mother eventually drank herself to death 3 years later, and the last thing she ever said was, "Don't let the world swallow you, Faye." Faye had promised, but the world swallowed her anyway. That's who she was the night she stopped her bike across from Caruso's, the most expensive Italian restaurant in Little Italy, the kind of place where men in 3-piece suits disappeared through the back door, and black Maybachs idled at the curb, and saw a silver-haired woman in a cashmere coat step out of a Lincoln Continental alone. Faye knew instantly something was wrong. She'd spent 6 months washing dishes in that kitchen after hours, and she'd watched that woman come and go dozens of times. She never, ever came alone. What Faye didn't know was that the woman was Lorraine Caruso, mother of the most dangerous man in New York, and that 2 professional killers were already moving toward her from a blacked-out SUV with a silenced pistol aimed at her. Kest. She also didn't know that the man she'd secretly called the boss in the dark, Cade Caruso, 36, jaw like cut marble, storm gray eyes cold enough to freeze your blood from across a room, would soon hold her face in hands that hadn't trembled once since the dark day. He stepped into his father's shoes and whispered 3 words he'd never said to anyone. "Don't disappear again." But that's getting ahead of the story. Because before any of that could happen, Faye Harlow had to make a choice, the same kind of choice she'd failed to make outside that convenience store 8 years ago, and this time, she didn't freeze. If this story hits you in the chest, smash that like button so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs to believe that courage doesn't require a weapon, just a heartbeat. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now because you don't want to miss what's coming. Now let's go back to that freezing December night on Mulberry Street, where a delivery girl with nothing to lose was about to change everything. What Faye couldn't see from across the street was what had happened 3 blocks earlier. 3 minutes before the Lincoln Continental stopped behind Caruso's restaurant, 2 black SUVs had cut across the intersection at the corner of Hester and Mott. Lorraine Caruso's 2 bodyguards, the men who had protected her for 15 years, were pulled from the escort vehicle before they could draw their guns. Fast, clean, professional. Not a single gunshot, not a single scream carried beyond the car windows. At the same time, Lorraine's driver had just opened the door for her to step out when an arm from behind dragged him into the darkness between 2 buildings. The Lincoln Continental sat abandoned beneath the pale yellow light, the driver's door still open, the seat empty. This wasn't a street robbery, wasn't some impulsive act by petty criminals. This was an operation planned down to the second, by people who knew exactly where Lorraine Caruso would be, when she would be there, what she would be carrying, and who would be with her. Lorraine stepped out of the car with the black leather briefcase in her left hand, heavy, held tight against her body. She had taken 4 steps toward the restaurant's back door when she noticed the silence. No footsteps from her guards behind her. No low hum of the escort vehicle idling at the mouth of the alley. Only rain and darkness, and a wrong kind of emptiness. Unnatural, out of place, something that shouldn't have been there. She turned her head. The black SUV without plates had stopped less than 15 meters away from her, its lights off, its engine silent, as though it had been there long before she arrived. 2 men stepped out, black raincoats, baseball caps pulled low, hiding half their faces. They didn't speak. They didn't signal to each other. They moved with the synchronization of men who had practiced together hundreds of times, every step calculated, every angle of their bodies blocking a possible escape route. Lorraine Caruso had lived in this world for 40 years. She knew what death looked like when it came walking toward her. Her right hand slipped into her coat pocket, where the Beretta was waiting, but the gunman in front was faster. He raised a long black matte professional pistol fitted with a suppressor and aimed straight at her chest. Across the street, Faye Harlow was bending down to unlock her bicycle when she saw everything through the reflected glass of the building opposite her. 2 black figures moving toward the silver-haired woman. The long, heavy black thing in one man's hand, The thing it took Faye half a second to realize was a gun. Her body froze. The feeling struck her like an undertow, so familiar it made her sick. The same paralysis, the same blank white space in her mind, the same feeling that her feet were glued to the pavement, as if gravity had become 10 times heavier. 11 seconds. The number didn't echo in her mind as words, but as sensation, as the metallic taste of blood in her mouth, as the ringing in her ears, as the blurred image of a carton of milk falling on a white tile floor, an image she wouldn't allow herself to see any more clearly than that. The assassin's finger was already on the trigger. Faye felt her body begin to turn away, begin to do what it had been programmed to do for the past 8 years. Run, vanish, survive by not existing. But this time, something inside her broke. Not broke like shattering, but broke like a lock snapping open. She couldn't stand still one more time. She couldn't watch one more person fall while her legs refused to move. Faye let the bicycle lock drop from her left hand, pulled the $8 pepper spray from her coat pocket with her right, and ran straight across the street toward the 2 assassins. Her feet struck the wet pavement. But she didn't just run. She grabbed her rusted delivery bike, using her momentum to push it furiously across the asphalt. 15 meters between her and the 2 assassins. 15 meters she swallowed in less than 3 seconds. When she was 4 meters away, she hurled the heavy, rusted bike straight into the path of the gunman. The bike crashed violently onto the street, its aluminum delivery box slamming into the sidewalk with a sharp, clean sound like a gunshot. The gunman flinched and turned his head toward the noise, only for 1.5 seconds. But 1.5 seconds was everything Faye needed. She raised the pepper spray and pressed it straight into his face from less than 1 meter away. The stream of chemicals shot out like liquid fire, hitting the assassin directly in the eyes and nose. He screamed, the sound choking in his throat, his burning eyes forcing his body to curl in on itself. His finger tightened on the trigger in a panicked reflex. The suppressed pistol gave off a sharp little cough, the bullet veering away from its original aim, slicing past Lorraine's left shoulder instead of driving through her chest. Lorraine staggered backward, her back hitting the side of the Lincoln, her left hand releasing the black leather briefcase and letting it fall to the ground. Blood began soaking through the cashmere at her shoulder, black and wet beneath the yellow light. The second man reacted faster than Faye had expected. He didn't panic, didn't shout, only turned toward her with the precision of someone used to being ambushed. His hand moved inside his raincoat, pulling something out. Faye didn't wait to see what it was. She grabbed the U-shaped steel lock she had dropped on the sidewalk when she started running, nearly 1 kilogram of solid steel, and swung it with both hands. She aimed for his right wrist. Steel struck bone with a dry, breaking sound she felt through her whole arm, vibrating all the way to her elbow. He howled, and whatever he had been holding fell to the ground with a metallic clatter, but he didn't fall. He was twice her size, his shoulders as broad as a door, and the pain only made him angrier. The punch came from a side she didn't see. His left fist swung into Faye's temple with the weight of his whole body behind it. The world burst into white light. Faye flew off the ground, weightless, as if gravity had forgotten her for a fraction of a second, and then the earth came back to meet her with all its cruelty. The back of her head struck the edge of the stone step outside the restaurant's rear entrance. Her right rib slammed into the pavement, and she heard 2 small cracks in a row inside her chest. Not loud, but clear, carrying a sharp pain that cut straight through her breath. Her left shoulder jerked hard as her arm flung backward at an unnatural angle, the joint slipping from its socket with a muffled pop. She lay face down on the wet brick pavement. Blood from the cut across her forehead ran into her left eye, hot and salty, staining half her vision red, the other half blurred, dimmed, darkened, as if someone were slowly turning down the brightness of the world. She heard footsteps coming closer. The second man's voice, cold and flat, without the slightest tremor. "Kill the girl. Take the case." Faye tried to lift her head, but her neck wouldn't obey. She tried to open her right eye, but the blood kept running into it. She felt the cold of the street seeping through her thin coat, felt the rain falling onto her back drop by drop like small fingers tapping against her spine, felt the pain in her ribs, and her left shoulder begin to merge into one single mass, burning and throbbing. And in that moment between consciousness and darkness, the last thought that passed through her mind wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was a strange kind of relief, so soft it almost felt like peace, because this time, she hadn't stood still. This time, she had run in the right direction. And even if she was about to die in the wet alley behind a restaurant, she could never have afforded to enter through the front door. At least this time, Faye Harlow hadn't frozen. The second man stepped over Faye as if stepping over an obstacle in the road. He bent down to pick up what had fallen from his hand when the lock struck him, a folding knife with a long steel blade, and turned back toward Lorraine. His right wrist dangled at the wrong angle, swollen and useless, but the knife in his left hand remained steady. The first man was still kneeling on the pavement, both hands covering his face, tears and mucus streaming from eyes scorched by pepper spray, the suppressed pistol lying in a puddle nearly 2 meters away from him. Lorraine Caruso stood with her back against the Lincoln Continental. Blood from the bullet grazed across her left shoulder, soaking black into the cashmere. She was in pain. She knew she was in pain because her left arm had begun to feel heavy, and her fingers were slowly going numb. But Lorraine Caruso wasn't the kind of woman who fell because of pain. She had endured things far worse than a bullet grazing her shoulder, had lived through nights much longer than this one, had stayed standing when men 3 times stronger than she was had collapsed. Her right hand drew the Beretta from the inside pocket of her coat, small, silver, fitting into her palm as if it had been made for her alone. She raised the gun, aimed, and fired. One shot, the bullet buried itself in the second man's right shoulder, the same side where Faye had shattered his wrist. He spun halfway around, the knife falling from his hand, his knee hitting the ground. Lorraine stepped away from the car, 2 solid steps, the Beretta lifted level with her eyes, the barrel pointed straight at the center of the second man's face. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the rain like a blade through thin cloth. Put the other knee on the ground, then crawl back to that car of yours. If you turn your head, the next one goes into your face. 63 years old, 1.65 meters, her shoulder bleeding, and she stood there as if she owned this alley, this neighborhood, this city, because in one sense, she did. The second man looked into her eyes and saw what he had not found in most of the people he had threatened in his life, the absolute willingness to pull the trigger. He didn't test it. He dragged himself toward his partner and hauled the first man up with his good arm. The 2 black shadows staggered into the SUV, the engine roaring, the tires spinning against the wet pavement, and the vehicle shot backward out of the alley before vanishing into the rain as if it had never existed. The alley fell silent again. Only the rain remained, and Lorraine's labored breathing. She lowered the gun, slipped it back into her coat pocket, and turned to look down at the ground. Faye lay on the wet brick pavement, eyes closed, blood from her forehead spreading into the rainwater around her head, forming thin red threads that slowly dissolved into the dark. Lorraine knelt. Her knees touched the cold pavement, rainwater soaking through her trousers, and she didn't care. She took off her cashmere coat with one hand, gritting her teeth when the fabric dragged across the wound in her shoulder, and laid it over Faye. The coat was heavy, warm, carrying the scent of jasmine and sandalwood deep in every thread. She placed her hand on Faye's cheek, her palm warm against skin as cold as stone. "Don't move, girl. Don't move." With her right hand, she pulled the phone from her pocket and pressed a single number. 1 ring. When the line connected, her voice was no longer the voice of a woman who had almost been killed. It was the voice of command. Low, steady, every word as heavy as lead. "Cade. It's Mom. I was ambushed behind the restaurant. Took a graze, but I'm all right." A roar came from the other end of the line, deep, violent, the voice of a man all of New York knew better than to anger. Lorraine cut him off. "Listen to me. I'm alive because of a girl. A delivery girl." She ran between 2 gunmen with pepper spray and a bicycle lock. "She's badly hurt. Bring Hugh. Bring Pax. Bring everyone." Silence held for 1 second on the other end. Lorraine lowered her voice another degree, almost a whisper, but every word was sharp as a blade. "My guards were taken down 3 blocks away. My driver was dragged off before I stepped out of the car. Someone knew tonight's schedule exactly, Cade. Someone knew I'd be alone. We have a rat in the house." She hung up, looked down at Faye. The girl was still breathing, shallow and fast, each breath forming a thin mist in the cold air. Lorraine gently brushed the blood-matted strands of hair from her forehead, her fingers trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from something she hadn't felt in a very long time. "What's your name, girl?" Faye opened her eyes, only a narrow slit, just enough to see the face of the silver-haired woman leaning over her. Those eyes sharp, yet strangely soft now. "Faye." Her voice was only a breath, a sound more fragile than the rain falling around them. Lorraine smiled. faintly, but truly. Faye, it means faith. Your mother chose well, because tonight you believed in the right thing at the moment it mattered most. Hold on, Faye. My people are coming. Faye wanted to say something more, but her mouth no longer obeyed her. The warmth from the cashmere coat slowly spread across her chest. The scent of jasmine and sandalwood wrapped around her like a pair of arms, and the darkness carried her away gently, like sleep, softer than any sleep she had ever known on the half-deflated air mattress on the kitchen floor in Queens. 8 minutes. From the moment Lorraine hung up to the moment the alley behind Caruso's restaurant turned into a fortress, it took only 8 minutes. 6 black Maybachs came rushing in from 2 directions. 3 blocking the alley entrance on the Mulberry Street side. 3 blocking the alley entrance on the Mott Street side, their engines cutting off almost at the same time. 24 men in black suits stepped out in silence. Not a word exchanged. Not a single voice calling to another. They spread out like water pouring into a mold, each man taking a position, each pair of eyes sweeping over one angle, each hand ready inside the flap of a suit jacket. 2 men sealed the restaurant's rear door. 2 controlled the fire escape of the building across from it. 4 formed a line at both ends of the alley, facing the street, blocking anyone who might try to pass through. The rest formed a protective circle around the Lincoln Continental and the 2 women on the ground. All of it happened without one wasted sound, like a machine trained for this exact moment. Faye didn't hear the cars arrive. She was drifting between consciousness and darkness, in that place where every sound seemed to echo up from the bottom of a deep lake. But she felt the change in the air, a new weight, a kind of power drawing close, strong enough to cut through even the fog inside her head. She forced her eyes open, only a narrow slit, her lashes sticky with dried blood, making everything blur as if she were looking through dirty glass. And she saw him. From the first Maybach, a man stepped out whom Faye recognized at once, even in her half-conscious, half-delirious state. The night boss. He was taller than she had imagined when she had watched him from across the street through the kitchen window. 1.88 meters, broad shoulders, long and certain strides, every step carrying an absolute certainty that the ground beneath his feet existed only to serve the direction he was moving in. A 3-piece charcoal gray suit, not a single wrinkle in it though rain was falling, as if even the weather didn't dare touch him. Black hair cut short and neat, a jawline sharp as if carved by a blade, high cheekbones creating cold, hard planes across his face, and the eyes Faye had only seen from a distance but now, at this range, were clearer than ever. Gray. Not smoke gray or silver gray. Storm gray. The color of the sky right before lightning strikes. The color of the sea in a tempest. So cold that Faye felt as if the temperature in the alley had dropped several more degrees just because he had appeared. Beautiful. But beautiful like a knife. Like something you knew would cut if you touched it, yet still wanted to reach for. Cade Caruso went straight to Lorraine first. He dropped to one knee, his hand lifting the blood-soaked cashmere at her shoulder, his eyes moving quickly over the wound. Lorraine gripped his wrist. "I'm fine. Look at the girl." Cade stood and turned. Looked down at Faye, and for the first time that night, he stopped. He saw everything in less than 3 seconds, but those storm gray eyes swept over her with the precision of a man used to reading a scene. The girl on the ground was so thin her collarbones rose sharply beneath her torn coat. A paper-thin shirt, faded jeans, sneakers worn down at the soles. On the pavement beside her, a small pink pepper spray bottle, the kind sold in grocery stores, and a steel U-lock for a bicycle, blood staining one end. Those were her weapons. An $8 can of pepper spray and a bicycle lock, used against 2 professional assassins with guns. A muscle twitched once in Cade's jaw. Only once, so fast most people would have missed it, but it was the only sign that something had just shifted beneath the ice he wore like armor. Hugh. Now, his voice wasn't loud, but all 24 men in the alley heard every syllable clearly. From the third Maybach, a tall, lean man with graying brown hair stepped out, a heavy canvas medical bag slung over his shoulder. Dr. Hugh Brennan. 15 years earlier, he had been a neurosurgeon at Mount Sinai Hospital, one of the finest pairs of hands in Manhattan. Then he had performed an unauthorized operation to save a patient without health insurance, violated hospital procedure, and lost his medical license. Caruso had found him in a free clinic in the Bronx and given him what the medical system had taken away from him, a purpose. Hugh knelt beside Faye, black gloves on his hands, his movements swift and clean, not a gesture wasted. A small flashlight shone into her pupils. His fingers pressed gently along the right side of her ribs. His hand supported her left shoulder joint and released it the moment Faye gave a faint moan in her delirium. He checked the pulse at her wrist, lifted one eyelid gently, watched for 2 seconds, then looked up at Cade. Mild concussion. 2 cracked ribs on the right side. Dislocated left shoulder. Stage 2 hypothermia. And boss, this girl is chronically malnourished. Her body was running on empty long before tonight happened. She's shutting down. Move her now. Not to a hospital. I need somewhere clean, warm, and without questions. Cade didn't look at Hugh. He was still looking at Faye. Looking at her small hand clenched into a fist even while she was unconscious, as if she were fighting something even in her dreams. Take her to the penthouse, he said. Then he turned to Lorraine, his voice dropping another degree. Who, mother? Lorraine looked at her son. Only 4 people knew tonight's schedule. You, me, Benedict, and the driver. The driver was dragged away before I stepped out of the car. Cade said nothing more, but those storm-gray eyes darkened by one shade, and all 24 men in the alley felt that change, even though no one saw it, the way you feel the air pressure shift before a storm comes crashing in. Warmth was the first thing that pulled Faye out of the darkness. Not the thin warmth of a torn coat or breath blown into cupped palms on a winter night, but real warmth, thick, heavy, wrapping her entire body from her feet to her throat, as if someone had lifted her up and placed her inside a cloud. She hadn't opened her eyes yet, but she could feel it. A mattress. A real mattress. Not the air mattress sagging on one side on a kitchen floor that smelled of grease, but a mattress so thick her body sank into it, so soft she didn't feel a single hard place pressing against her spine. A heavy blanket covered her, smooth cotton fabric molding to the curves of her body, holding in heat like an embrace that wouldn't let go. For the past 5 years, waking up had always meant getting ready to endure something. The cold, the hunger, the phone ringing with a delivery order, the snoring of a stranger sleeping less than 1 meter away from her. But this morning, none of that was there. Only silence, warmth, and the smell of coffee. Faye opened her eyes. A high white ceiling, soft light filtering through curtains. She was lying in a living room larger than the entire studio she shared in Queens. Dark furnishings, oak, leather, and to her left, a floor-to-ceiling glass wall looking out over the Manhattan skyline, the 42nd floor. The city spread out beneath her like a glowing map under the early December sky, and it took Faye a few seconds to realize she was looking at the same city that had forgotten her, only from a height she had never known existed. Good morning, girl. Lorraine Caruso sat in the armchair beside the bed, her left arm secured in a sling against her chest, her right hand holding a cup of coffee. She had changed clothes, her silver hair falling loose across her shoulders, a simple black sweater on her body, but her posture was still as straight as it had been last night. Still the same sharp eyes, only now they were softer, warmer, looking at Faye with something like the way a mother looks at a child after a long illness. From the open kitchen came the sound of a pot touching the stove, and the smell of chicken porridge. Walt Hennessy, the night cook who had once secretly set aside porridge for her in exchange for 2 hours of dishwashing, stood in a kitchen 10 times larger than the restaurant kitchen, stirring a pot with a wooden ladle. When he turned back and placed a bowl of porridge on the table beside Faye's bed, his eyes were red, his lips pressed tight, and he didn't say a word. He only set the bowl down, looked at her for 1 more second, then turned away. Faye ate slowly. The porridge was hot, perfectly salted, the shredded chicken melting on her tongue. She finished the bowl, and it was the first hot meal she'd had in 3 days. Lorraine said nothing, only sat there drinking coffee and watching her eat with the patience of someone in no hurry. When Faye set the bowl down, she looked around the room and saw the kitchen door open. A double-door stainless steel refrigerator stood in the corner, taller than she was by an entire head. She didn't know why she got up and walked toward it. Maybe because of instinct. Because 5 years of hunger had taught her that food was something you had to find, had to check, had to make sure was real before you allowed yourself to believe in it. She opened the refrigerator door. It was full. Milk, eggs, cheese, fruit, vegetables, meat, juice, containers of food arranged neatly on every shelf, more than all the food she had eaten in the past month combined. Faye stood there, both hands gripping the open refrigerator door, cold air blowing against her face, the light inside shining over her bruised features, and she cried. Not sobbing, not making a sound. Tears ran down silently, over the bruise on her cheekbone, over the bandage on her forehead, falling onto the marble floor she had never imagined her bare feet would ever stand on. Lorraine watched from the armchair but didn't get up, didn't come toward her, because she understood that there are moments when a quiet presence is enough, and any gesture beyond that would be too much. 2 hours later, Cade Caruso walked in. He didn't knock. He closed the door behind him, pulled out a chair, sat across from Faye at the glass table in the living room, less than 2 meters away from her, and began asking questions. His voice was even, cold, without 1 gram of emotion. This wasn't a conversation. This was an interrogation. Full name, age, current address, what she was doing in that alley at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, since when, who sent her, whether she knew who the woman in the Lincoln was, whether she knew who owned Caruso's restaurant, who she was working for, whether she owed anyone money. Faye answered every question, truthfully, briefly, without circling around anything. She had nothing to hide because she had nothing. When Cade asked, "Family?" Faye was silent for 3 seconds, then spoke, short, dry, her voice flat, as if she were reading a police report instead of telling him about the worst night of her life. Her brother, Tommy, 16 years old, shot during a convenience store robbery, dead at the scene. Her mother, Nina, collapsed afterward, became an alcoholic, died 3 years later. No father, no relatives, no one at all. Cade fell silent. A full 10 seconds. Heavy. 10 seconds Faye could count one by one, because she was used to counting silences that decided her fate. Then he stood and placed 3 things on the glass table. A new phone, a black credit card with no name printed on it, and a silver key. "There's an empty apartment on the 38th floor. It's yours from now on. When you're well, we'll talk again." Faye looked at the key. Why? Cade had already turned his back and was walking toward the door. He stopped but didn't turn around. "It's not charity. It's a debt. And Caruso always pays his debts." He walked out. The door closed. Faye looked at the key on the glass table. Small, bright, lying still beneath the light, and she felt her chest tighten around something she couldn't name. The next morning, at 6 o'clock, while the penthouse was still quiet, Faye placed the key on the marble counter in the kitchen, beside the phone and the credit card, all 3 untouched. She put on the old clothes someone had washed clean and folded neatly on a chair, and she left the building through the staff exit in the basement. No one stopped her. She took the subway back to Queens. Standing in the shaking train car at 6:30 in the morning, her ribs aching with every jolt, her left shoulder burning every time the train braked, Faye looked at her reflection in the window glass, bruised face, bandaged forehead, dark circles under her eyes, and she knew what she looked like. She looked like something people gave to because they felt sorry for it. And Faye Harlow didn't accept handouts, not because of pride, but because she had learned that every time someone gave her something for free, there was always a price attached that she couldn't afford to pay. She reached her rented room. The air mattress had gone completely flat during the night she had been gone, lying limp on the kitchen floor like a piece of wrinkled plastic. The mini refrigerator hummed, and inside it were half a carton of expired milk and 1 packet of instant noodles. The 3 people she lived with had gone to work, and the room was empty and cold and so small the walls seemed to be pressing in on her from all 4 sides. Faye sat down on the deflated mattress, hugged her knees, and wondered what she was doing. The knock came at the door close to 10 o'clock in the morning. Faye opened it and saw Lorraine Caruso standing in the hallway. She wore a black wool coat, her left arm still in a sling, her silver hair pinned neatly back, standing in the corridor with peeling paint on the walls and cracked linoleum underfoot, as if she were standing in the lobby of a 5-star hotel. She didn't say anything for the first 5 seconds. She only looked over Faye's shoulder into the room, looked at the flat mattress, looked at the rusted mini refrigerator, looked at the damp, mold-stained wall, and the tiny hand-sized window facing the brick wall of the building next door. Then she looked back at Faye. "You don't owe anyone, Faye. Not my son, not me, not any person from that night. But you owe yourself a chance to live decently, and you can't repay that debt in this place." Faye looked at Lorraine, looked into her eyes, searching for the things she had trained herself to search for in people's eyes over the past 5 years. Pity, calculation, the price hidden behind kindness. She found none of them. Only truth. Faye turned back and looked one last time at the deflated mattress on the kitchen floor. Then she picked up the only backpack she owned, stuffed a change of clothes, and the photo of Tommy she kept in her wallet into it, and stepped out the door. The night Faye returned to the building, Cade called Paxton Ferraro into the office on the 43rd floor and closed the door. Paxton was 40 years old, with a long scar running from his left temple down to the corner of his jaw. The underboss. The only man allowed to enter this room without an appointment. That girl, Cade said. Follow her. 1 week. I want to know who she knows, who's paying her, whether she has any connection to Brighton Beach or Volkov. Anything that doesn't fit. Paxton nodded once, then turned away. He understood. An unknown girl had appeared at the right time, in the right place, saved the right person, with courage so perfect it looked like something written into a script. In Cade Caruso's world, perfect coincidences didn't exist. A perfect coincidence was a trap whose wires you hadn't seen yet. 7 days later, Paxton came back with a thin file. Thin because there was nothing to find. Faye Harlow, 27 years old, born in Queens, no criminal record. No bank account that had held more than $300 at any point in the past 5 years. No contact with any organization, no suspicious relationships, no one standing behind her. 14 temporary jobs, none lasting longer than 4 months. Clean, boss, really poor, really hurt, nobody behind her. Cade looked at the file, looked at it for a long time, then closed it and pushed it aside. That was how Cade Caruso said "I believe" without ever opening his mouth. While Cade was checking her from above, Faye began again from the bottom. On the 3rd day after she came back, her left shoulder still aching whenever she raised her hand higher than shoulder level, Lorraine took her down to the kitchen of Caruso's restaurant to meet Monte Greco. 65 years old, Italian by blood, balding silver hair, a white apron stained with at least 3 kinds of sauce, and a face that looked as if his last smile had happened decades ago. Monte didn't greet her, didn't ask how she was, didn't shake her hand. He looked her over from head to toe, looked at her left arm held close to her body, then said, "Dishes. Stack on the left. Hot water. Don't break anything." Faye washed dishes for 4 hours on the first day, hot water rising to her elbows, her right hand scrubbing while her left could only hold plates at a low angle because her shoulder wouldn't let her lift higher. On the second day, Monte put her in front of a cutting board and a pile of onions. Cut. Small dice. Even. She cut slowly, clumsily, her eyes stinging, her left shoulder twinging every time she pressed the knife down and forgot to keep her elbow low. Monte stood beside her and watched without correcting her. When she finished cutting, he picked up a pinch of onion, studied the size, and dropped it back. Again. Cut again. Slower. The first 4 days were onions. The 5th day was garlic. The 6th day was carrots. Monte didn't praise her, didn't criticize her, didn't explain. He only handed her ingredients, watched her cut, and told her to cut again. In the kitchen, there were no exceptions. No, she saved the boss lady's life, so she should get special treatment. She started from zero like everyone else. And that was what made Faye respect him from the very first day. At the end of the 2nd week, when Faye could cut onions evenly without looking down at the board, Monte called her over after closing. From a drawer, he took out a small paring knife, its steel blade about 10 centimeters long, its dark oak handle worn smooth by years, light, perfectly balanced. He placed it in Faye's palm. A chef's knife is like a soul. It doesn't leave you. You keep it, you care for it, you carry it with you. When you pick it up and it feels like part of your hand, that's when you begin to be a chef. Faye looked at the knife. Small, light, but when her fingers closed around the wooden handle, she felt something she hadn't felt since the night she had held the pepper spray and run across the street. Certainty. Not the certainty that she would be all right, but the certainty that she was holding something that belonged to her, something she had earned herself through 4 days of cutting onions until her eyes burned and 2 weeks of washing dishes until her hands were scalded. That night, Faye slipped the knife into the inside pocket of her coat. From then on, it never left her. When she went to the market, when she went up to the rooftop, when she slept, it lay at the head of her bed. Not because she was afraid, but because it was the only proof that she was becoming something more than a delivery girl New York had deliberately forgotten. The nightmare came at 3 o'clock in the morning, as it always did. Tommy stood inside the convenience store, a carton of milk in his hand, turning to look at her through the glass door, his mouth moving as if he were trying to say something she never heard in time, because the gunshot always came first. Faye shot upright in bed, sweat damp at the back of her neck, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The apartment on the 38th floor was silent, dark, the glass wall reflecting her shadow as she sat curled on the mattress. A small shape in a room far too wide for someone used to sleeping on a kitchen floor. She knew she wouldn't fall asleep again. She put on her coat, stepped into the hallway, entered the elevator, and pressed the button for the rooftop. The December wind on top of the 42nd floor building was cold enough to cut through skin, but Faye didn't go back down. She needed air, needed space, needed something larger than four walls and the piece of memory that repeated itself every night. Then she saw him. Cade stood at the edge of the rooftop, his back resting against the steel railing, his face turned toward Manhattan. He wasn't wearing a suit. For the first time since Faye had seen him, he wasn't wearing that three-piece armor of wool fabric and coldness measured down to the last millimeter. Just a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, the collar open by 2 buttons, a glass of whiskey in his right hand, the city lights catching the veins in his forearm, and the watch face on his wrist. He looked tired. Not tired from lack of sleep, but tired in another way. The kind of exhaustion that belongs to someone who has carried something too heavy for too long without ever being allowed to set it down. Cade heard her footsteps, but he didn't turn around. Faye stopped about 2 meters from him, stood beside the railing, and looked across the East River. She didn't speak. He didn't speak. 15 minutes passed in silence, with only the wind and the distant hum of the city below, the car horns, the airplanes, the breathing of 8 million people sleeping or lying awake because of nightmares of their own. 15 minutes no one felt the need to fill with words, and the silence wasn't heavy, wasn't awkward. It was simply there, natural as air, as if the two of them had stood beside each other on this rooftop hundreds of times before. Cade was the first to speak. He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the skyline, the whiskey turning slowly in his hand. "You have your number. 11 seconds. Faye didn't answer, but her body stiffened a little, just enough for Cade to know he had touched the right place. "I have a number too," he continued, his voice lower now. Not the voice of a boss or an interrogator or the man all of New York feared. The voice of someone saying something he didn't say to anyone. 3 minutes. That's how late I was when my father was shot. My mother called. I drove there, and when I ran in, he was already lying on the restaurant floor with 2 bullets in his chest. The doctor said he kept breathing for 4 minutes after he was shot before he lost too much blood. 4 minutes. I was 3 minutes late. If I'd been 3 minutes faster, I would have made it. If I'd been 3 minutes faster, he'd still be alive. He took a slow drink of whiskey, and Faye saw his jaw tighten as he swallowed. Not because the liquor was strong, but because of something more bitter than liquor that he was swallowing with it. Since the day I took over this family, I've counted those 3 minutes every single night. Faye looked at him, truly looked, not through the suit and the coldness and the wall he had built between himself and the rest of the world. She saw it, just beneath the surface, hidden behind those storm-gray eyes and the jawline that never softened, the same wound she had carried in her own chest for 8 years. The guilt of the person who arrived too late, the guilt of the one who survived. She had 11 seconds. He had 3 minutes. Different lengths of time, but the pain was exactly the same. The same question, with no answer repeating every night before sleep. What if I'd been faster? What if I hadn't stood still? What if I'd been there? "I know," Faye said. 2 words, but the way she said them, softly, without pity, without comfort. Only the pure acknowledgement that she understood because she was living inside the same prison, made Cade turn to look at her for the first time. And in that moment, under the yellow light of the city rising onto both their faces, something shifted between them. Not loudly, not dramatically. Only a thin thread reaching from one wound to another, silent and strong. They stood there a little longer on the rooftop, saying nothing more. But the silence afterward was different from the silence before. It felt strangely easy, strangely light, as if simply speaking their number to someone who had a number of their own had made them both a little less alone. And for the first time in 8 years, when Faye went back down to the apartment and lay in bed again, she slept without dreaming of Tommy. 4 weeks after the night on Mulberry Street, Faye was walking from the kitchen to the upper floor to get more cleaning towels when she caught Benedict Ashford stepping out of the conference room at the end of the hallway. 45 years old, navy blue suit, salt and pepper hair combed neatly back, polished leather shoes, a measured smile as he nodded to her while passing by. Cade Caruso's legal advisor, personal attorney, the man who held every number and every secret. Faye nodded back, stepped aside to let him pass, and right as he moved by less than half a meter from her, she smelled it. Her brain exploded. Not exploded with pain, but in the way every filter between the present and memory was ripped apart in 1,000th of a second. That scent. Sandalwood mixed with musk, warm, faintly sweet, with an underlayer of leather and cardamom she couldn't mistake even though she had tried to forget it for 4 weeks. She didn't know that scent, because she understood expensive cologne. She knew it because that night on Mulberry Street, when the second assassin swung his fist into her temple, he had been close enough for the smell on his coat to burn itself into her memory as deeply as the bruise on her face. Her brain had stored that scent in the same compartment as the sound of her ribs cracking and the taste of blood in her mouth, locked tight, never erased. It was what the therapist at the free clinic called hypervigilance, sensory memory carved so deeply by PTSD that she could recognize the jasmine on Lorraine's coat in a crowd of 1,000 people. And now the same cologne from the assassin was drifting from the collar of Cade Caruso's legal advisor. Faye stopped in the middle of the hallway, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She wasn't 100% certain. She was only a delivery girl learning how to cut onions. What did she know about expensive cologne and conspiracies of betrayal? But she also knew that the last time she hadn't been 100% certain was when she stood outside a convenience store and lost 11 seconds before acting. This time, she didn't lose 11 seconds. She went straight up to the 43rd floor, knocked on Cade's office door, and when he looked up from behind his desk with gray eyes asking what is it without needing to open his mouth, she told him, briefly. The cologne on Benedict smelled exactly like the scent on the assassin that night. She didn't know what kind it was, didn't know the brand, but she was sure because she had smelled it from a few dozen centimeters away when he punched her, and her memory of that night was never wrong. Cade looked at her for 3 seconds. No doubt, no asking again, no telling her she must be mistaken. He picked up the phone and called Paxton. Lalabo. Check the Santal 33 line. Check what Volkov wears. Who orders custom batches. Whether Benedict has any connection to any entity tied to Brighton Beach in the past 6 months. Paxton took 48 hours. Lalabo Santal 33. A niche cologne line ordered privately with a custom concentration. And the only customer in the New York area who ordered that version was Yuri Volkov. The scent was distinctive enough and strong enough that anyone sitting in the same room with Volkov for more than 10 minutes would carry it afterward. Benedict Ashford had sat in the same room with Volkov, and not just once. Paxton dug further. $750,000 transferred into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, registered under Benedict's name. Money from a shell company directly linked to Volkov's financial network. 2 transfers. One 2 weeks before the night of the attack, one 3 days afterward. Payment for information. Payment for Lorraine's schedule. Payment for betrayal. That night, Benedict Ashford was brought by 2 men into the war room in the basement. The windowless concrete room with a heavy oak table in the center, and white lights so bright there was no shadow to hide in. The evidence was spread across the tabletop: bank statements, surveillance photographs of Benedict getting into a car belonging to Volkov's people, the cologne records, the money trail. Benedict looked at all of it, then raised his eyes to Cade, who stood at the head of the table, empty-handed, storm gray eyes so calm they were more terrifying than any gun. Benedict tried to justify himself. The organization's move toward legitimacy was a mistake. It was suicide. Volkov had proposed cooperation, not hostility. He had done it for the future of the whole family, for long-term survival. Cade let him speak. Let him speak until he buried himself with his own words. Then, when Benedict stopped to breathe, Cade said 6 words. Each word fell like a hammer. "You sold my mother, Benedict." Silence. The kind of silence whose weight you could feel pressing against your chest. Strip him of everything. Keys, cards, phone, everything carrying the Caruso name. You leave New York before noon tomorrow. If anyone in this city sees your face after noon tomorrow, our next conversation won't happen in this room. Benedict understood. His face shifted from gray to white. He removed his watch, laid down his keys, laid down his phone, laid down his business cards on the table, one thing at a time. The sound of metal touching wood echoing through the concrete room like a countdown. When he was let out, Cade stood alone, looking at the pile of belongings on the table. And in that moment, his storm gray eyes were no longer cold. They were tired. Tired because one more person he had trusted had betrayed him. Tired because in this world, Loyalty was the rarest and most expensive thing money couldn't buy. Then he thought of the girl downstairs in the kitchen. The girl who had smelled the truth on a trader's collar with nothing but the wounded memory inside her. And the muscle in his jaw loosened a little, only a little. 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 hours after Benedict Ashford had been stripped of everything bearing the Caruso name and vanished from the building like a shadow erased from a wall, Faye stood alone in the restaurant kitchen, wiping down the stainless steel counter. She didn't need to wipe it. The kitchen had been clean since 11 o'clock at night, when the last shift of staff had gone home. But Faye couldn't sleep, not because of the nightmare this time, but because of what she had seen on Benedict's face when he laid each item down on the wooden table in the war room. Fear, desperation, and beneath all of it, the strange relief of a man who had finally been caught. She had recognized the cologne on his collar with the memory of her own trauma, and that truth had led to a man losing everything within 48 hours. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel about that. She only knew she couldn't sleep, so she wiped the counter, wiped the stove, wiped the cutting boards, wiped things that were already clean, because her hands needed to do something so her mind would think a little less. Footsteps sounded on the kitchen tile. Faye didn't need to look up to know who it was. Over the past 4 weeks, she had learned the rhythm of his steps. Long, even, certain. The stride of a man who never hurried because the world would wait for him, not the other way around. Cade Caruso stood in the kitchen doorway, his shoulder resting against the steel frame, his hands loose at his sides. No suit, no whiskey, only a white shirt and those storm-gray eyes that, in the pale yellow kitchen light, looked more tired than she had ever seen them. "You're not sleeping." It wasn't a question. "Neither are you," Faye answered, still wiping the counter, though the counter already shone clean. Silence for 3 seconds. Then Cade spoke, his voice lower than usual, the same voice she had heard on the rooftop the night he told her about the 3 minutes. "Your eyes see what other people don't see, Faye." Her hand stopped moving. She looked at him. "It's not a gift. It's just damage. My brain broke the night Tommy died. It can't stop scanning everything around me for danger. The doctor called it a disorder. I don't control it. I don't care what the doctor called it." Cade left the doorway and stepped into the kitchen. Each of his steps on the tile echoed through the empty space. "Your damage just saved my family for the 2nd time." He stopped less than 1 meter from her, the closest he had stood to her since the day they met, close enough that she could smell the sandalwood on his skin, the trace of whiskey still lingering on his breath, the clean scent of his shirt, and beneath all of it, the unnamed scent of power, of danger, of a man she knew very well she should stay away from. Though her feet refused to move back, Cade lifted his right hand, slowly, as if he were testing himself to see whether he truly wanted to do this. His fingers touched her chin, lightly, briefly. The tips of his fingers were warm against her skin. One single point of contact. Not enough to call it a caress. Not enough to call it possession. Only enough to confirm that she was here, that she was real, that she wasn't a 2 o'clock in the morning hallucination in the mind of a man who had grown used to living without trusting anyone. Then he lowered his hand, turned, walked away, without saying another word. His long, even footsteps faded down the hallway. Then came the sound of the elevator closing, then silence. Faye stood in the empty kitchen. The cleaning cloth was still clenched in her right hand, the steel counter still polished bright beneath the yellow light, and around her were steel walls, a steel ceiling, steel tables, every surface hard, cold, and smooth. But the only sound in the kitchen at that moment wasn't the air conditioner or the low hum of the freezer. It was the sound of her own heart beating, fast, hard, clear, echoing off the steel walls around her as if the whole kitchen were beating in time with her, and her skin, at her chin, where he had just touched her, was still warm. 5 weeks after the night on Mulberry Street, on a Thursday evening, Faye was cleaning the kitchen after closing when Lorraine's black leather briefcase slipped from a chair in the private dining room and fell to the floor. The case sprang open, and several sheets of paper slid across the tile. Faye bent down to pick them up, intending to tuck them back inside, when her eyes passed over the bold print in the corner of the first page. A round seal, capital letters. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Beneath it was an agreement dense with legal terms. Faye didn't fully understand, but she understood enough. Immunity agreement, cooperation terms. Caruso. The phrases leapt off the page as if they had been printed in fire. Faye placed the documents back into the briefcase, fastened the lock, and set the case back on the chair exactly where it had been. Her hands didn't shake. Her face didn't change. 5 years at the bottom had taught her how to hide everything happening inside her. But inside, in that moment, everything was falling freely. The Caruso family was cooperating with the FBI. Cade Caruso, the boss all of New York feared, was trading information for federal immunity. Everything she thought she knew about this building, about the men in black suits, about the world she had stepped into since the night she ran across the street holding a can of pepper spray, all of it now had another layer she had never seen before. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, when Cade entered his office at 7 o'clock, Faye was already waiting in the hallway outside his door. He looked at her, recognized at once that there was something different in her eyes, something harder than usual, and opened the door for her without a word. The door closed. Faye stood across from him, the oak desk between them, and asked directly, "Are you Mafia or a witness?" Cade didn't blink, but he also didn't answer right away, and that pause said more than any answer could have. "You saw the documents." It wasn't a question. Lorraine's documents fell out of her briefcase in the dining room. "I didn't search. I didn't dig. I picked them up, and I read enough. How much is enough? Enough to know you're trading everything you built for a piece of paper from the federal government saying you and your family won't go to prison." Silence. Cade stood behind the desk, both hands braced on the wood, his head slightly lowered, and for the first time since Faye had known him, she saw something crack across that flawless surface. Not anger, not fear. Exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that belongs to someone who has carried a secret too heavy for too long and has finally had someone see it. "I'm the man trying to keep everyone I love alive." His voice wasn't cold. It wasn't flat. It trembled at the edges, just a little. Enough for Faye to know that the armor he wore every day was truly shaking now. "My mother is 63 years old. She has lived in this world for 40 years, and she deserves to sleep in peace without being afraid someone will kick in the door at 3 o'clock in the morning. 400 people follow me, their families, their children, and all of them will be dragged down if I don't find a way to bring them out of the dark. The FBI isn't an ally. The FBI is the only door I can see, and the price of opening it is something I pay every day with pieces of who I am." He lifted his head and looked at her. Storm gray eyes, but now there was no ice, no wall, only a man standing bare inside his own truth in front of the girl he hadn't trusted a month earlier. "Including me?" Faye asked. Her voice was softer than she wanted it to be. "Everyone you love. Including me?" Cade didn't answer, but his eyes shifted. From her eyes down to her left shoulder, where the collar of her shirt sat slightly crooked, revealing the edge of the long scar. New skin pale pink, the lasting reminder of the violently dislocated joint from the night she threw herself into the path of the assassins to protect Lorraine. The phantom pain she carried on her skin because of his mother. His eyes stopped there, stopped long enough for Faye to understand that he was looking at the answer, instead of saying it aloud. Then he looked back into her eyes, and in that moment, there was no need for another word. She gave a small nod. He gave a small nod. And the distance between them, the distance created by the oak desk, and the difference between their two worlds, narrowed a little more without either of them taking a single step. 6 weeks after the night on Mulberry Street, and 2 weeks since Benedict Ashford had disappeared from New York, everything was quiet. No unfamiliar cars parked around the building, no signs of unusual movement from Brighton Beach. No word from Paxton's network of eyes and ears about any activity carrying Volkov's mark. 2 weeks of absolute silence. And that silence was the most dangerous thing of all, because it made Cade Caruso do something he almost never did. He lowered his guard. Not completely. Cade wasn't the kind of man who took his hand off a gun just because the sea looked calm, but he reduced the number of guards at the penthouse from 12 to 8, pulled back some of the patrols around the restaurant, and when Faye asked him whether she could go alone to the Italian market at the end of Arthur Avenue in the Bronx on Saturday morning to buy fresh ingredients for the kitchen, he hesitated. She saw that hesitation in his eyes, the way those gray eyes narrowed by 1 millimeter, the way his jaw tightened and then released. She knew he wanted to say no, but she also knew that 6 weeks of living inside a 42nd floor building with bulletproof glass and 24 men in suits, guarding every entrance and exit, had begun to make her feel as though she were living in a golden cage, and a cage, no matter how beautiful, was still a cage. She wanted to go to the market. She wanted to choose tomatoes with her own hands, smell fresh basil, bargain over the price of cheese with the old Italian man at the stall at the end of the market. She wanted a normal morning. Just one morning. 2 hours, Cade said. You take your phone. You don't turn it off. You don't go far from the market. Faye nodded, and that was Cade Caruso's only mistake. Not the mistake of carelessness, but the mistake of a man learning to trust someone enough to let go, and letting go at the wrong moment. Faye reached the Arthur Avenue Market at 9 o'clock in the morning. She spent 40 minutes moving between the stalls, choosing San Marzano tomatoes, buying a bundle of basil, tasting ricotta cheese from the hand of an elderly silver-haired woman whose English carried an Italian accent. She smiled for the first time in many days, a real smile, small, but real. And that moment lasted exactly 3 seconds before the black SUV braked hard beside the curb right behind her. She didn't have time to turn her head. A large hand wrapped in a black leather glove covered her mouth from behind. Another arm locked around her waist and lifted her off the ground, and she was dragged into the back seat of the SUV before anyone in the crowded market could realize what was happening. Her grocery bag fell onto the sidewalk, tomatoes bursting red across the concrete, basil crushed under the feet of passers-by. The car door slammed shut. The vehicle sped away. 14 minutes later, Cade's phone rang. It wasn't Faye calling. It was a message, a photograph. Faye sat on an iron chair, her hands bound with plastic zip ties, her mouth sealed with tape, her eyes wide open and staring straight into the camera. Behind her was a bare concrete wall, industrial lighting, and a man Cade recognized at once even though his face wasn't shown. The build, the way he stood, the military boots. Yuri Volkov. The message attached to the photograph had only one line. You know what I want. Come alone. Brooklyn, the old factory on Kent Street. If I see anyone else, the girl dies first. Cade looked at the photograph, looked at Faye's eyes in the image. She was afraid, he could see that, but she wasn't crying, wasn't begging. Her eyes looked straight into the lens as if she were looking directly at him and saying, I'm still here, I haven't broken. And something inside Cade Caruso's chest, something he had kept silent for 21 years since the day he saw his father lying on the restaurant floor, burst open like fire. Paxton stood beside him, waiting for orders. Cade spoke, his voice so calm it was terrifying. The calm of the ocean just before a tsunami. Volkov won't only come to Brooklyn, he'll hit everything at once. The restaurant, the penthouse, the warehouse, using Faye as bait to draw me out. Call everyone. Everyone. The 5 boroughs, Jersey, Connecticut. Paxton lifted the phone. Within 15 minutes, 400 members of the Caruso organization began moving into the defensive positions they had rehearsed in advance. Cade divided his forces. 350 men would hold the 3 targets. Paxton would command the penthouse defense and protect Lorraine. Colton Russo would hold the restaurant and the Brooklyn warehouse. 50 men would go to Brooklyn to save Faye. Paxton looked at Cade. Who leads the team of 50? Cade didn't answer. He didn't need to answer. He had already put on his coat, already slid the gun into the holster at his hip, already stepped into the elevator. He would lead the 50 himself. Because there are some things the boss of 400 people can't delegate to anyone else. And Faye Harlow, sitting on an iron chair with her hands tied in an abandoned factory in Brooklyn, was one of them. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Volkov made his move. 10 unmarked cars split into 3 groups and tore through the empty streets of New York at the same time, each group heading toward a different target. 30 mercenaries, former soldiers from Eastern Europe and the Middle East, armed with automatic rifles, tactical armor, night vision goggles, moving in formation like the military units they had once belonged to before Volkov's money bought their loyalty. 12 men hit Caruso's restaurant on Mulberry Street. 10 hit the penthouse. 8 hit the warehouse in Brooklyn. Simultaneously, precisely, coordinated down to the second through encrypted earpieces. Volkov had planned this before Faye was kidnapped, perhaps before Benedict was exiled. Perhaps from the first moment he decided that the Caruso empire had to fall so he could swallow New York whole. Faye was only the final bait, the thing meant to pull Cade out of his fortress so Volkov could strike at the foundation. But Volkov didn't know that Cade had read his move before he ever sent his pieces forward. And Volkov didn't know that 400 men were waiting for him. At Caruso's restaurant, 12 mercenaries arrived in 2 fake commercial vans parked at both ends of Mulberry Street. They stormed through the front and rear doors at the same time, breaking them open with breaching hammers, glass exploding outward, laser sights sweeping across the dark dining room. They expected an empty restaurant at 3 o'clock in the morning, at most a few security guards they could take down in 30 seconds. Instead, they met Colton Russo and 80 men who had been waiting behind every column, every overturned table used as a barricade, every kitchen door leading into corridors. Colt had turned into death corridors. The first wave was stopped at the door. 12 mercenaries pushed into the restaurant, without knowing they had just locked themselves inside the trap. Colt wasn't a man of many words, but when he said fire, 80 guns spoke at once. At the penthouse, 10 mercenaries arrived through the service elevator and the fire stairs, 2 assault routes at the same time. They had night vision goggles, stun grenades, and floor plans Benedict had sold to Volkov before he was exiled. But those floor plans were outdated. The moment Benedict was exposed, Paxton had changed the entire security system. New elevator codes, new stairwell locks, new cameras, new defensive positions. When the 10 mercenaries climbed to the 39th floor through the fire stairs, they met Paxton Ferraro and 120 men blocking 3 consecutive floors. Paxton stood at the top of the stairs on the 40th floor, the scar on his face lying in shadow, his voice rolling down the stairwell like an echo from the bottom of a well. "You climbed the wrong building." That was all he said before everything exploded. Gunfire thundered inside the concrete stairwell, multiplied 10 times over by closed walls and narrow space, turning every shot into a sound bomb. Volkov's mercenaries were pinned on the 39th floor, unable to go up, unable to go down, trapped between 2 floors of gunfire like rats in a box. Below, in the basement, 7 layers of concrete beneath the battle, Lorraine Caruso sat in the safe room. Steel walls 30 centimeters thick, the door locked from the inside, cameras watching every corridor around them. She sat on a wooden chair, back straight, silver hair pinned neatly up, black sweater, a Glock resting on her right thigh, her finger beside the trigger. Not on it, because Lorraine Caruso was a woman who understood patience. Dr. Hugh sat in the corner, his medical bag already open, gauze, hemostatic clamps, morphine, ready for things he hoped he wouldn't have to use. From above, the sound of gunfire came through the ceiling, low and muffled, passing through 7 layers of concrete and still clear enough to know that above them was a battlefield. Hugh looked at Lorraine. "Are you worried?" Lorraine didn't look up from the camera screen. "Cade doesn't lose. Cade doesn't know how to lose. My son was born in this world, raised in this world, and if this world wants to take his life, then this world will have to stand in line." At the Brooklyn warehouse, the remaining 8 mercenaries struck the industrial building Caruso used as a logistics center. Colt's 150 men, divided between the restaurant and the warehouse, were already waiting behind steel containers and refrigerated trucks. The battle at the warehouse was shorter than the other 2. 8 men against 100 in a place made entirely of steel and concrete, with nowhere to hide. 15 minutes. That was all the time needed for 8 mercenaries to realize they had been tricked into dying. By 4 o'clock in the morning, all 3 targets were still standing. Volkov's force at the restaurant had been completely neutralized. 12 men lying on the dining room floor among broken glass and overturned tables. At the penthouse, the 10 men trapped in the stairwell had laid down their weapons. At the Brooklyn warehouse, none of the remaining 8 were left standing. 350 of Caruso's men held 3 fronts without losing a single life. 7 were wounded, none critical. Dr. Hugh would have work to do, but not the kind of work he feared. But the battle wasn't over, because the remaining 50 men were on their way to Brooklyn, and leading them was Cade Caruso, the man who didn't know how to lose. Driving through the night toward the abandoned factory on Kent Street, where Faye Harlow sat on an iron chair with her hands tied, and Monty's paring knife still hidden inside the inner pocket of her coat, where no one had thought to look. The abandoned factory on Kent Street was a 6-story block of concrete, pressed against the edge of the East River. Once a fish canning plant in the 1970s, now nothing more than a cement skeleton, with broken windows and rusted staircases. Cade arrived at 4:15 in the morning with 50 men spreading silently around the building's perimeter. His phone vibrated. A second message from Volkov. "Rooftop. Alone. 2 minutes. Paxton gripped Cade's arm. No. 1 word, but it carried 15 years of loyalty, and the only fear Paxton Ferraro allowed himself to have. The fear of losing the man he had sworn to protect. Cade removed Paxton's hand, gently, but firmly. "Surround the stairs. When you hear something, come up." He walked into the building alone. The concrete stairwell was pitch black, smelling of mildew and standing water. every footstep echoing through the empty shaft like a countdown. 6 floors. He climbed without stopping, without slowing, the gun in the holster at his hip but both hands loose at his sides, because Volkov had demanded that he come alone, and Cade knew that if he drew his weapon before he saw Faye alive, she would die before his bullet ever found its target. He pushed open the rusted iron door onto the rooftop. The December wind off the East River struck his face like a cold hand. Rain slanted sideways, fine and sharp, needles against the skin. The Brooklyn night sky held no stars, only a low ceiling of clouds reflecting the city lights into a dirty orange color that lay over everything. And in the middle of the rooftop, Faye sat on an iron chair, her hands bound behind her back with plastic zip ties, wet hair plastered to her face, her coat soaked through with rain. Standing behind her was Yuri Volkov, 42 years old, half a head taller than Cade, shoulders as broad as a man built rather than born, wearing a black tactical coat, the barrel of a suppressed Sig Sauer pressed against Faye's right temple. Faye's eyes found Cade through the rain. She was afraid. He could see it in the way her shoulders shook, but her eyes weren't panicked. Her eyes held his straight and steady, as if seeing him was enough for her to know she wouldn't die here. "Cade Caruso," Volkov said, his Russian accent thick, his tone as calm as if he were reading a menu. Finally, face to face. "I thought you'd bring an army. You said alone." "I came alone." "Yes, because this delivery girl matters enough to you that you're willing to put your life on the table." Volkov pressed the muzzle harder against Faye's temple. She closed her eyes for 1 second, only one, then opened them again. "This little girl ruined every plan I had. First, she spoiled the ambush with pepper spray. Then she sniffed out Benedict by his cologne. A delivery girl, Caruso. A delivery girl destroyed an operation I spent 6 months building." "Let her go," Cade said, his voice flat as water before a storm. "This is between you and me. She has nothing to do with it. She became involved the night she ran into my men with a bicycle lock." Volkov laughed, short and joyless. "My men should have killed her that night." Faye heard every word. And beneath the thick medical gauze wrapping her cracked right ribs, Monty's paring knife was safely hidden. Small, light, its steel blade 10 centimeters long, its oak handle worn smooth. When Volkov's men kidnapped her, they had stripped her outer jacket and searched her waist, but they purposefully avoided pressing tightly against her heavily bandaged, dislocated shoulder to keep her conscious for the camera. They never imagined a delivery girl would endure the agonizing pain of taping a blade directly beneath a fresh wound. Faye gritted her teeth against the blinding pain, shifting her bound hands behind her back until her dominant right fingers managed to slip under the edge of the gauze around her ribs. Her fingertips touched the familiar wooden handle. She pulled the knife free with her uninjured right hand, the cold steel brushing the skin of her wrist, and she cut. The plastic tie snapped, not completely, but enough for her to yank her right hand free from the loop. All of it happened in 3 seconds, while Volkov was looking at Cade and not at her. Faye twisted in the chair, channeling every ounce of strength into her healthy right arm, and drove the paring knife directly into Volkov's right wrist, the wrist holding the gun against her head. The 10-centimeter blade pierced skin, pierced tendon, and struck bone. Volkov roared, the sound not human, the sound of a wounded animal, of steel through flesh, and his finger released the trigger. The Sig fell from his hand, clattering against the concrete floor, then skidding away through the rainwater. Faye rolled off the chair, fell to the left, her shoulder hitting the wet concrete, then rolled again until she was out of Volkov's reach. Cade lunged forward. He didn't draw his gun. The first punch landed against Volkov's jaw, with the full weight of 21 years of rage behind it. Volkov staggered back, his right hand useless because the knife was still buried in his wrist, but he was still former Special Forces, still reacting with his left hand, swinging a hook into Cade's ribs. Cade took the hit, gritted his teeth, and struck back. The two men fought across the rooftop in the wind and rain, 2 black shadows twisting together beneath the dirty orange Brooklyn sky. Cade was faster, more precise, every blow aimed at a weakness. Volkov was stronger, but his right wrist was pumping blood around the blade buried in bone, and with every second that passed, he weakened a little more. The iron door to the rooftop burst open. Paxton, Colt, and 12 men rushed up the stairs, guns in their hands, spreading in a fan across the rooftop. Paxton charged in, tore Volkov away from Cade, and forced him down onto the concrete, one knee pinning his back, his hands locked behind his neck. Colt tied him, Volkov lay face down on the wet concrete, rain falling on his back, blood from his wrist spreading into the water, and he laughed. The laugh of a man who knew he had lost, but wanted his enemy to know he wasn't afraid. Cade didn't look at him. Cade was looking at Faye. She sat on the concrete several meters away, drenched, hair stuck to her face, her right hand stained with Volkov's blood, trembling from cold, from adrenaline, from everything at once. But she was alive. She was alive, and the knife was no longer in her hand, because it was still buried in the wrist of the man who had nearly killed her. Cade spoke into the radio. 2 words. Call FBI. Volkov wouldn't die tonight. He would be handed over to the federal authorities, with all the evidence of 30 mercenaries, 3 simultaneous attacks, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder. His empire would collapse not by bullets, but by law. And that was how Cade Caruso won without becoming the thing he was trying to leave behind. Faye didn't know when the rain stopped. She only knew that somewhere between the moment Volkov was forced down onto the concrete and the moment she stopped trembling, the Brooklyn sky stopped falling, and the eastern horizon began turning from black to gray, then to a fragile, pale pink, thin as new skin over a scar. Faye was still sitting on the wet concrete floor, her back against the rooftop railing, her knees drawn up to her chest, Volkov's dried blood on her right hand beginning to flake away in brown patches when she curled and uncurled her fingers. Paxton and Colt had taken Volkov downstairs and handed him over to the FBI team that arrived in 3 unmarked gray SUVs. The rooftop was empty. Only she and Cade remained. He stood a few steps away from her, phone pressed to his ear, his low, even voice giving orders, checking the damage at all 3 targets, confirming Lorraine was safe in the basement room, listening to Paxton report that there had been no Caruso casualties, and that Lorraine's driver had been found tied up but alive in the Mulberry Alley. When he hung up, he stood still for a moment, his back turned to Faye, looking out toward the East River slowly revealing itself under the dawn. Then he took off his suit jacket, the charcoal gray piece he wore like armor every day. He unfastened each button, slipped it from his shoulders, then turned back and knelt beside Faye. He draped the jacket over her shoulders. The wool was warm, carrying the scent of sandalwood and smoke and something that belonged only to him, and when he pulled the lapel up to cover her neck, his hand brushed the scratch there, the mark left where Volkov's gun barrel had pressed too hard into her skin, and his hand trembled. Faye saw it. Cade Caruso's right hand, the hand that had taken Volkov down on this rooftop 5 minutes earlier, the hand that had held guns and signed orders and gripped power for more than 20 years, was trembling as it touched the wound on her neck. A small tremor, at the fingertips, the kind only someone close enough could see, but Faye was close enough, and she saw it as clearly as she saw the sunrise climbing behind his shoulder. Cade realized she had seen it. He didn't hide. He didn't pull his hand back. He left his fingertips resting against the scratch on her neck, and his eyes looked at her with something she had never seen in those storm-gray eyes before. Not coldness, not control, but fear. Pure fear. The fear of a man who had almost lost something he hadn't known he needed until it was almost taken from him. Don't ever disappear from my sight again. His voice was hoarse, low, breaking at the edges. Faye looked at him. Her face was wet, her hair stuck to her forehead, dried blood on her hand. So exhausted she wasn't sure whether she was awake or dreaming, but she was still Faye Harlow, and Faye Harlow didn't take orders from anyone, not even the most dangerous man in New York kneeling in front of her with trembling hands. Is that an order or an offer? Cade closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, the last piece of armor had fallen. A plea. And I don't beg anyone. Faye lifted her left hand, small, cold fingers, and placed it against his cheek. Cade leaned his face into her palm, closed his eyes, and in that moment, on the rooftop of an abandoned factory in Brooklyn, under a sky shifting from night into day, the most powerful man in New York looked like a 15-year-old boy who had arrived 3 minutes too late. He leaned his forehead against hers, close, warm. His breath touched her lips. Her breath touched his, and the final distance between them, the distance they had both felt for 6 weeks but neither had dared to cross, dissolved like rain on the river at dawn. He kissed her. Slowly, gently, cold, cracked lips, touched lips salted by rainwater and maybe by tears neither of them would admit to. Not frantic, not rushed, only 2 people who had carried their wounds for too long finally finding a place to set them down. 1 week later, the Caruso family estate on Long Island. The property stretched across 4 acres, stone walls, iron gates, a white gravel drive running between 2 rows of winter bare oak trees. The grand hall, ceilings 6 meters high, white marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and 400 men standing in silence inside. 400 members of the Caruso organization, from the 5 boroughs of New York, from New Jersey, from Connecticut. The men who had held 3 fronts the night Volkov attacked stood in 2 long lines from the doors of the grand hall to the foot of the main staircase. Black suits, backs straight, eyes forward. Absolute silence. 400 men breathing without making a sound. Cade stood on the 5th step, Lorraine at his right, Paxton at his left. His voice needed no microphone to carry through the marble hall. 6 weeks ago, someone tried to kill my mother. They almost succeeded. They failed because a girl who wasn't one of us, who owed us nothing, who had nothing but pepper spray and a bicycle lock, and the kind of courage most men in this room will never have, stood in their way. He stopped. She saved my mother in an alley. She found the traitor by scent. She drove a knife into Volkov's hand while a gun was pressed to her head. 3 times, she put her life down for this family. This is Faye Harlow. She is family. Anyone who touches her answers to me. The doors of the grand hall opened. Faye walked in. She was dressed simply. A black coat, hair loose, the scratch on her neck healed, the scar on her shoulder hidden beneath fabric. Small in the vast hall, small among 400 tall men in black suits, 400 men stepped apart, creating a path down the center, just wide enough for one person to pass through. Faye walked, slowly. Every footstep on the marble floor rang out in the absolute silence, and every man she passed, one by one, placed his right fist against the left side of his chest, over his heart, and bowed his head. No words, no applause, only the fist over the heart and the bowed head, the highest sign of respect in their world, given to the delivery girl from Queens who had bled 3 times for a family she hadn't been born into, but had chosen. Faye reached the foot of the stairs. Tears ran down her face and she didn't wipe them away, because for the first time in 8 years, she wasn't ashamed of crying. Cade reached down. A large, warm hand, the hand that had trembled on the Brooklyn rooftop, but was steady now. Faye took it. He pulled her up to stand beside him on the step, and 400 fists remained over 400 hearts. Lorraine stood at his right, watching her son look at Faye, watching the way his eyes softened when she stood beside him, watching the corner of his mouth lift, not enough to call it a smile, but enough for a mother to recognize. She said softly, only loud enough for Cade and Faye to hear, "I've waited 21 years for that smile." 6 months after the night on the Brooklyn rooftop, Faye Harlow stood in the kitchen of Caruso's restaurant on a busy Friday evening, both hands moving swiftly over the cutting board. The paring knife Monty had given her 6 months earlier, now a little more worn at the wooden handle from daily use, and in her hand now, it no longer felt like a talisman, but like a part of her body, exactly as Monty had said it would when she truly became a chef. She wore a white kitchen shirt, the left side of the chest neatly embroidered in black. Faye Harlow, sous chef. She had gained 10 kilograms in 6 months. Her shoulders were rounder, her cheekbones no longer hollow. Her skin had color. Her hair was cut neatly to her shoulders, and when she looked at her reflection in the steel surface of the kitchen counter, sometimes she didn't recognize the woman looking back at her, and that was good. That meant the skeletal delivery girl who once peddled through winter nights in Manhattan had truly become someone else. Beside her on the kitchen counter was a pot of pasta boiling, tomato sauce cooking from the recipe Lorraine had taught her in the penthouse kitchen, a recipe passed down through 3 generations in the Caruso family, from Lorraine's mother-in-law to Lorraine, and now from Lorraine to Faye. Every time she cooked this dish, every time the scent of basil and garlic and ripe tomatoes rose from the pot, she thought of her. Thought of those sharp but gentle eyes, thought of the cashmere coat laid over her on the wet pavement that night, thought of the calm voice saying, "Faye means faith." Monty stood in the corner of the kitchen watching her work, arms folded across his chest, his face still carved from stone, but there was something different in his eyes. Something anyone who had known him long enough would recognize as pride, though he would never admit it if anyone asked. One Sunday morning in late June, Cade drove Faye to a cemetery in Queens. She didn't know where they were going until the car stopped, and she looked through the window to see 2 new white marble headstones, standing side by side beneath a maple tree, white lilies planted around them. Tommy Harlow, Nina Harlow. Cade had found Tommy's grave in the public cemetery, where the boy had been buried 8 years earlier with city assistance. A place with no headstone, only a small metal marker pressed into the ground with his name and 2 numbers, and he had moved him here, placed him beside his mother, placed him in a cemetery with green grass and shade and fresh flowers every week. Faye stood in front of the 2 headstones, her hands hanging at her sides, and she cried. She cried for a long time, cried silently, cried the way she hadn't allowed herself to cry for 8 years because she had been too busy surviving to have time for pain. Then she knelt, her knees touching the grass, her hand resting on the cold stone of Tommy's headstone, and she spoke. "Little brother, I found a home. I'm sorry for those 11 seconds. I'll carry them for the rest of my life. But I won't let them kill me anymore. I stood still for 11 seconds outside that store that night, but I've never stood still again since then, Tommy. Never again." She turned toward Nina's headstone. "Mom, I kept my promise. I didn't let life swallow me. It took a while, but I kept it." Behind her, Cade stood a few steps away, silent, not speaking, not touching, giving her space. When she stood up, eyes red, face wet, he didn't say anything profound, didn't offer philosophy, didn't try to comfort her with words. He simply opened both arms, wide and silent, and waited. Faye stepped into them. He held her between 2 quiet rows of graves, among white lilies and bright June sunlight, and that moment needed no words, because some things can only be said by holding someone tightly and not letting go. That night, on the balcony of the 42nd floor, Faye stood in Cade's arms, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on the top of her head. Manhattan spread out below them. Millions of lights, millions of stories, millions of people living lives no one ever saw. "That delivery girl would never believe this," Faye said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. Cade tightened his arms around her waist a little. "That delivery girl was braver than anyone I've ever known. She just needed someone to see it." Faye tilted her head back and looked up at his face, the sharp jawline, the storm-gray eyes, but now there was no ice in them, no wall, only her. "You saw it. I saw it. New York has 8 million people. This city once counted Faye Harlow as nothing, as invisible, as one more woman pedaling through the night delivering food to strangers who never bothered to look at her face. But Faye Harlow taught us a lesson no book could ever write as beautifully as the life she lived. A person's worth is not in what they own, not in the balance in their bank account, or the clothes on their body, or the address where they sleep each night. A person's worth is in what they are willing to give up for someone else. In the moment they choose to run toward danger, instead of turning away. In the small, quiet courage of a girl holding an $8 can of pepper spray and running across the street in the rain to save someone she had never met. Sometimes we think we need to be rich, powerful, or strong before we can change someone's life. Faye's story reminds us that isn't true. Sometimes all you need is the decision not to stand still. Sometimes all you need is 11 seconds of being braver than your fear. And sometimes, the deepest wound in your heart, the thing you thought only made you weaker, is the very thing that saves someone else and, in the end, saves you too. If this story touched you, if it made you think of someone in your life you've never told that you see them, press the like button so more people can hear this story. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they're not invisible. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, subscribe now so you don't miss the new stories every day. We'd love to hear from you. How did Faye's story make you feel? Who did it remind you of? How does it connect with your real life? Leave a comment below. Share with us the thoughts deep in your heart, because every one of your comments matters, and we read every single line. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace, ease, and quiet happiness. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.